And I think there's a madness that comes from not being in contact with place, with people, with live, complex organisms and dynamics. And I think that's disassociation. And I think we're experiencing the madness of disassociation as a culture. And I imagine it's been building for some time, for centuries, and we will adapt to it. We will figure out how to associate, but we won't remain disassociated as a species and survive. Because then you don't care about anything.
Hello, and welcome to the Insight Podcast from the Zion Canyon Mesa, a residency center for the arts and humanities in Springdale, Utah, surrounded by Zion National Park. I'm your host, Logan Hebner. Craig Childs is an adventurer and writer, but above all else, he's a desert dweller, a citizen of aridness. He's the author of about a dozen books, including The Secret Knowledge of Water, Atlas of a Lost World, and Virga and Bone. Craig joins us from his front porch in western Colorado with snow falling and ravens croaking in the junipers. He talks about how stories repeat in places. He shares his thoughts on the many obstacles that can keep us from connecting deeply to a place today. He touches on social media, the internet, and other things that can result in disassociation. He ponders the conundrum of being descended from white colonizers, while at the same time being rooted to the places where fate has deposited him. Craig believes that we have a responsibility to give back to these places and their first people, who have given us so much. A lot of his work is an effort to do this. To quote, "I'll be dead and gone before I ever really figure out what needs to be fed back into this place. But at least I can get close. At least I can do my best." Finally, Craig reads from his journal, excerpts that may or may not make it into his forthcoming book about rock art, to be published by Torrey House Press. He is interviewed by Zion Canyon Mesa's own Ben Kilborn. Ben, how did you first encounter Craig Childs?
I don't have a clue. I really don't. I know that the first thing I encountered was The Secret Knowledge of Water. There was just people talking about it. I just heard murmurs of something about magic shrimp appearing in potholes, and I was intrigued.
Those. They're crazy, those triops. It's really weird out there.
Yeah, so I was like, wait, who is this guy?
Right.
Okay, I will read that.
For me, when I first got here from back east in 81, I immediately connected with Abby, of course, with the gobsmacked desert, so beautiful, so quiet, so ethereal, and angry at stuff going on around. So I immediately resonated with him, and he was at first. But then when I started living here, and years later, I think Childs was asking the questions that I started to ask after that initial wonderment and astonishment. Is how do I fit in? What am I doing here? What is this place? How can I relate to it? How do I relate to the first people here? And I found that Childs' work directly spoke to me about those next steps, about how to actually be here.
So he brought up some things about belonging to you, it sounds like.
Yeah, we're sort of the same age. I'm a little older, but there was just something about his path and my path that I found myself asking questions that he was articulating the answers to much, much better than I could.
Right.
I also love his sense of humor. I remember seeing him, watching him or listening to him read and perform, and he did a bit about trying to rescue a raccoon from a water tank, and it was absolutely hilarious. And
I remember that story. Yeah,
I mean, he's performing it, he's acting to it, and he had there are over 100 of us there, and we were all in stitches. And also anybody that camps out in a cornfield for a while in the middle of Iowa just to see what it's like, I'm interested in that guy.
Oh yeah, me too. Not that I want to go walk through a cornfield, but
we don't have to. He did it for us.
He did it for us.
He took one for the team.
I just saw on Facebook today, actually, he was posting about how a couple of years ago, he and one of his sons backpacked across Phoenix, trying to stay off of the asphalt as much as possible, and because there are these little mountain ranges that kind of go through the valley.
There's Camelback. There's a lot of them.
Yeah, so he tried to stay on those and move through an urban environment in that way, which is a really intriguing way of interacting with that urban and natural interface.
That's part of our landscape now.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I look forward to this, Ben. Have fun.
Yeah, I just want to start by saying I've always enjoyed your work. I think I've read most of your books. I think the only one I haven't picked up is Finders Keepers for some reason, but I haven't made it to that one yet.
Maybe it's a
But
dangerous one.
maybe, I don't know. But I've always loved your work because you don't just research and write from home all the time. You make a point of going out to the place you're writing about and immersing yourself in it. In The Secret Knowledge of Water, for example, you trace your very being into the rock itself by mapping waterholes in the Cabeza Prieta, among other places. In House of Rain, you follow the ancestral Puebloans across the desert, walking in their footsteps to gain a particular kind of understanding. In Virga and Bone, you immerse yourself in aridness and walk through it with curiosity directed at your very affinity for it. And in Apocalyptic Planet, you backpack through cornfields in Iowa, among other similarly wild trips. So I want to ask, what are the benefits of this writing process, or what do you hope to gain through this process that you don't think can be gained in any other way?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think that I do it that way because that's the way I prefer to be in the world, to participate with it, especially natural landscapes. So I almost think the writing process for me of going into these places and experiencing them directly is a byproduct of how I actually want to do it, how I feel like one, or how I feel like I should be moving in the world. I think there are a lot of ways of writing. I think you can write without touching the land at all, but you're not. You're writing something different, and my purpose is to write from the place, the very tactile place, and not to be separate from it, or to be as unseparated as I can, to be as connected to it as possible, and from there I think I can convey a bit more of what it's like to be out in it and on it, and how ideas come to you from it, and how the landscape is what generates the writing. So I think that maybe I could write from a controlled, closed space. I don't know what that's like. Just let my imagination run, but it's getting out of the echo chamber of your own head to an extent, going into a place and reflecting on it, using what's coming to you from it. And I think to know a subject, at least for me, or to feel like I can even scratch the surface on a subject, I need to be immersed in it. I needed to occupy all of my senses so that I forget whatever I came with. I've got outlines or concepts, things that I'm trying to accomplish, but really it's where that place takes me. And often it takes me to places where I have to throw away what I came with, what I imagined. And I don't think you have to do that if you're not there. I think you can arrange things however you want in your head and write about them, but being there, the place does the arranging for you, and you end up following it.
Yeah, I'm recalling I heard an interview with you where you were talking about how you like to get to a point where you almost forget your own name.
Yeah, yeah, because you get in the way of the story, and I think you also affect it. You change it. Each person. I mean, when you tell a story, it's coming through you. You're a lens, but you don't want to be the only thing going on there. You want to be the translator or offering it, but it's not really a story about you. It's a story about it.
Yeah, so let's talk about story. I've noted several times in your books where you talk about how the place determines the stories that play out there. And in The Secret Knowledge of Water, when you're describing various human histories in the Cabeza Prieta, you write, these are stories and they say something about the place the same way water tells the shape of an object as it passes, but the stories are not the place. All the names and the deaths and the bones piled up to keep the wind from leaving the country are our replies to this landscape. What did you mean by this, that stories are not the place, but show the shape of a place?
Yeah, that I would say that the place is the primary thing. The place is where you start from, and the stories are what the place generates. They're the conversation that comes out of it. So they, I guess if I really wanted to write, if I really wanted to convey the depth of a place so that you were actually there, the only way I could do that is by you being there. The story is one step removed. You can see the pattern of the mountain ranges and the history, the potsherds in the ground, and all the stories that are being told by the ground. But you're telling it. It's not actually happening. You're conveying it. So in my mind, there's a separation between the story and the place. The story is a translation. The place is the original. The place is the moment. Is where it's actually happening. And I guess when I write, I'm trying to put the reader in the place where it's happening, so to remove as many barriers as possible between you and the moment.
That's awesome. And you also talk about how stories tend to repeat. Like, for example, I think it was in Atlas of a Lost World, you have to bail after this one cold night out on Lake Superior to go sleep in a snow shelter instead. And it was your version of adaptation, you said. And I remember I saw you speak at the King's English here in Salt Lake a few years ago, or maybe it could have just been last year, I'm not sure. And
They fly by.
time is broken now. But you said maybe you can't help replaying the old stories. I mean, they're written into the place, the source where people came from. Meaning, in this example, others would have adapted in the same way.
Mm-hmm.
So do you feel like sometimes stories repeat themselves? Because why wouldn't they? The geology hasn't changed that much. Nothing has changed that much in some ways.
Yeah. I think stories are whatever drives it. If it's something mystical and inexplicable, some memory that's floating in the air or embedded in rocks, or if it's the way that the environment pushes you one direction or another, I think the same places produce some of the same kinds of stories. In that example, on Lake Superior, I was out there to look at what was happening 12,000 years ago in the Ice Age during a particularly cold spell, 1,000-year long deep freeze that hit, and how people would have adapted to it. So I went up to Lake Superior in January during a polar vortex cold freeze event, and I just wanted to get out there and go, okay, now I'm freezing my ass off. Now I know what it was like, or at least I can get close to it. And then at some point I went, it's actually too cold. This is beyond my limit. I got to get in a snow shelter. I got to get off this frozen lake. And then going, okay, I'm doing what they did, what people did over thousands of years. They moved into shelters and And then, I didn't go on. And in the book, I stopped with that snow shelter, but then the next night, I hooked up with a friend in Ashland, Oregon, who had, or Washburn, not Oregon, Wisconsin, um, who had a dog team and sleds, and we took off, each of us with a dog team, to his line camp, where he had a tent and a wood stove. And so night by night, I was stepping it up. I was, one night out on the frozen lake with it booming all night, just freezing, just, I don't know what it was, 30 below or more. And then the next night in a snow shelter going, oh, this is so much warmer. And then the next night, which didn't end up in the book, in a canvas tent, with the dogs all outside, buried in snow, curled up, and us around this wood stove. And I was just looking at it going, oh, this is our evolution as a species. This is the direction we did it. I just took that trip in 3 days. And in that way, yeah, that story is replaying itself. And I take note of it. I go, oh, this is a story. I am enacting a ritual. I am repeating what took tens, hundreds of thousands of years for the human species. But I also think on a tighter, more fine-grained level, stories repeat themselves in where exactly you move and where you sleep, where you step. Maybe even the stories that come to you, the way relationships unfold. I think stories on so many levels are embedded in landscape, and they keep coming out. They're different every time. We have different tools. We have different ways of speaking and thinking, but the story remains.
You're making me think of the chapter Landlines from Virga and Bone, where you talk about how your personal story waiting out a lightning storm on top of that butte outside of Farmington was so similar to the story of Changing Woman that the archaeologist told you when you were there. Could you say a little something about that and how those stories overlapped?
That was definitely one of those moments of stories coming together, because I had, years before that happened, I went to that butte in northern New Mexico, with my wife and our baby, and we just went up there to camp. And a huge lightning storm hit that night, and we hunkered down. It was, amazing. we're pinned to the ground with a baby in between us in a tent, and safe, because we're on the ground. We're probably not going to get hit by lightning, right? There were radio towers on the other end of the butte that were distracting the lightning, and then I don't know if it was 15 years later or so, I was teaching a course, with Will Sozi, a Navajo archaeologist, and he had a stop at this butte, and he said, "This is our an emergence point for the Navajo. This is on top of this butte. There was a great thunderstorm, and first woman, first man, and first child were up here on top of this butte." And as he's saying this, I'm kind of stumbling backwards, going, "Wait a minute! I had a baby and was on top of this butte with my wife, and there was a thunderstorm, and he said, "Oh, you're not supposed to be on this butte. That's why there was a thunderstorm, because that's taboo." And I had no idea. It was just a butte out in the desert, and so to hear this, I'm thinking, oh, maybe this is just what happens. You step into a flow that is there in the landscape, and you reenact a story in one way or another. And if you have all the pieces, if it's you and the mother of your child and a child, then maybe that just fits right into the space. And I have no way of explaining scientifically how that would happen.
I know that's what's happening in my mind right now. I'm like very excited about this, and yet I'm going, why?
Yeah, and there is a point where I have to say, I don't know why. I don't have enough information. Maybe someday scientific tools and measurement will say, oh, there's a residual memory that exists on a quantum level, and it influences things around it, and it repeats the story. This is all. It's actually very simple, but I don't know. At this point, I just go, okay, well, that happened, and that is evidence of connection or coincidence. And maybe it is just coincidence, but I have to. After a while, you see enough coincidences, and you step back and say, okay, there's a connection here. There's something I'm not seeing. The way that a story continues to play out, no matter who you are.
I'm suddenly flooded with paranormal questions I want to ask you, but that sort of like deviates a bit from the direction I was wanting to go. But I'm just like, I keep thinking you've been out enough that you've probably encountered several things that you just simply can't explain.
Oh yeah, all the time. I mean, you can chalk it up to, well, if you're out long enough, a bunch of weird things are going to happen. But then you start to add them up. You start to look at them scientifically. You compare them to each other, and you say, well, these actually do have relationships. And I believe that there is. I mean, if as a science writer, I think that science says the things you don't know, you don't know. You may learn about them in the future, but you can't say right now. Like I remember a prominent scientist said that we've proven that God doesn't exist. And I thought, that is one of the most unscientific things you could say. That is something you don't know about. You don't have tools for measuring this. So as a scientist, you ought not be saying that, because these things that are mysterious may be mechanically very, very provable if we had the right ways of seeing. So I think that, yeah, I've seen enough out there where I go, okay, there's a lot more happening here. But I think everybody would have that. I don't think it's just being in the wilderness. I think a life in an apartment, you would eventually go, there's something happening here that is more than I can see.
Totally. I completely relate. We won't get into ghost stories right now.
Oh, we could.
I mean, if you've got one you want to tell, that
would take a whole episode.
Okay, all right, some other time. I guess I want to veer into just aridness. You talk a lot about your love for arid places, and it seems to me like one of the main purposes or benefits of connecting to a place in an immersive way, like you've already talked about, is the sense of rootedness to that place that allows. And I just love this Wendell Berry quote that I want to read real quick. He says, "To have a place, to live and belong in a place, to live from a place without destroying it, we must imagine it. By imagination, we see it illuminated by its own unique character and by our love for it." And to my mind, at least, I see you doing this work as you express affection for arid places. And as someone who was born and raised in southern Utah, I was born in Kanab and grew up in Price, I feel this as well. And I do recognize it as the work of being a resident of a place, a good neighbor or citizen. And I came up with this word or this phrase. It feels like you're attempting to be a good citizen of aridness or a good community member of aridness. Do you feel that way about your work to some degree?
Yeah, it's aridness is my life. I probably spent half my life growing up in the desert. And I definitely feel this affinity for the place that's different from any other place. Both belonging there and both that it satisfies my eyes to see the desert, to see horizons like that. So I feel like my writing is a way of maybe echoing back to it, giving back to it, uh, being thoughtful of the place, being responsive to it. I suppose if I grew up in a temperate rainforest in the Pacific Northwest, which sometimes I wish I could get out of the desert and go there because it's so amazing, but it's not my place. But if I was from there, I think I would be doing the same. I think I would be a citizen of a temperate rainforest. But the desert is where I feel most comfortable and where I feel like if there's one place I can return something to, it's the desert. And so I hope that my writing is a way of the desert giving me something and me turning it into something else and handing it back, going, look what I've made with what you've given me. And I think there's a responsibility that comes with that to pay attention and to look for where you can add and look for also where you detract. And, what do you do that doesn't help this place? How to get around that, how not to do that, how to, just what is your relationship with the desert? Is it something that you are feeding into, that you're feeding it? Because I feel like it feeds me. There's no greater pleasure for me than walking out into it. And that's something that I don't think I should have for free. I think that our work, whatever our work is, it should be returning to that, giving back to that.
Yeah, I get that sense from your work. It feels like maybe not as dramatic as a call to action for all of us to feel responsibility to the place that we're in, but it does feel that way to me.
Yeah, and I think a lot about the call to action, because one of my purposes is a call to connection, which I think is the first call to action, to say this actually matters, pay attention to it, make connection with it. And to me, that's an action. Maybe one of the more important actions we can make is connecting, and then deciding from there, okay, how am I going to do this? What do I have to offer?
Do you feel like there are things right now that are inhibiting connection for people more than, I'm thinking obviously about the internet. It has sort of a superficial connection that seems to not actually be what it's doing. There's that. Are there other things that you think are particularly problematic right now in terms of people not having a connection to the place that they're in?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of barriers to that right now. I just came out of the backcountry yesterday and was in southeast Utah and looking at rock art and making connections between rock art panels, figuring out how the lay of the land based on petroglyphs and pictographs. And I was thinking about disassociation, how I'm trying to associate with things. I'm looking at a rock art panel going, okay, what is my relationship to you? What is yours to me? What is our association? And then I look out into the world that I'm very much part of, the world of internet and computers and highways and paper clips. And I see disconnection there. I see a lack of relationship. Sometimes I have more relationship with the computer than I do with a human being. And I don't think that that's necessarily wrong, but you need to still have both. I think we should be. Now that we have a tool, we've got internet and computers, cultivate that relationship, do something with it, make it into something. But it's also such a barrier because I feel like we're peeling away from each other, and I'm spending so much time on my phone and on my screen, and dealing with that world, which is a conduit. It's a creative world. It's a place to make things happen, but it's also, I think, inherently distracting from the tactile world. And I think one of the problems we're having right now is that we're disassociating. I think that we're losing relationships, especially right now. I mean, we're not hugging, we're not gathering in groups, we're separated from each other, and we're coming up with all kinds of backdoor routes and creative ways of connecting, but that's another inhibition, another thing that's stopping us from associating. And I think there's a madness that comes from not being in contact with place, with people, with live complex organisms and dynamics. And I think that's disassociation. And I think we're experiencing the madness of disassociation as a culture. And I imagine it's been building for some time, for centuries, and we will adapt to it. We will figure out how to associate, but we won't remain disassociated as a species and survive. Because then you don't care about anything. And I can feel it. I can feel it at times. I go, well, how many steps am I from disassociating? How many layers are between me and other things? I mean, we're using podcast, but then writing is the same thing. You're disassociating. You're one step away from your subject, but then you're like doing a podcast. You're trying to tie back to whatever it is you're contacting, the land, the story. You're trying to make an association there, which is the same thing I'm doing with writing. Is going, okay, I've got a tool. How can I use this tool without separating from everything?
Yeah, that's great. I've noticed that you're actually fairly active on Facebook.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I'm curious how that's developed for you, and what sort of. It's a different kind of connection, as you said. You are connecting to your audience in some way, but they're spread out all over everywhere.
Yeah, it's a mixed bag. I mean, I use Facebook as a journal, really. Or I look around for something in my day. I go, okay, what's beautiful about this day, or what remarkable thing did you see, and can you write it in one or two lines? So in a way, it's a writing tool, and it's a venue. I'm always looking for a venue, a place to tell a story. But then I also feel the oppressive nature of it, how it controls how we see things, and so I have a mixed relationship with it. Sometimes I say, I got to get off of this, but then the same thing that, if you use Facebook, I'm sure you have the same experience of going, oh, there's my friend who I wouldn't have been in touch with. And there is a connection there. I don't believe it's totally disconnected. I hear of a friend, or I see somebody from long ago, and I go, oh, there you are. You're a climbing guide in the Tetons, and you're skiing, and you're doing, oh, amazing. I connect with you, even though we're not talking, but I have this dose of you that comes to me. And so I think it's a dangerous tool. It has the ability to connect, but on a really fundamental level, it can just tear us apart because it simplifies things. It's, my life on Facebook is not my life. It's the best parts. It's the most shiny parts, and anything that's shiny is probably deadly. So you keep that in mind. I look for sincerity on Facebook, but then I often wonder. I say, well, I'm being sincere about my life, but I'm not mentioning the number of times that I weep. I'm not mentioning my frustration. I'm not, This is not a whole picture. It's part of it, and it's a tool. So I think it should be used that way.
Yeah, it's definitely curated, and I think it's easy to forget that sometimes, and people fall into that trap of thinking that everybody else's life is better than theirs.
Yeah, I think I think we. I mean, I'm fortunate that I can spend the time in the backcountry that I do, and that gives me a lot of that's high quality living out there. Um, uh, but the indoor life, it's also beautiful, but it's also wrapped up in machines and messages and deadlines and madness. Trying to keep up with the world, and I look at other people's lives and I think, oh, we're all doing this. We're all making the best damn go of this we can, and sometimes that's enough to make the existence of Facebook or social media positive for me, to look around and go, okay, we're all doing our best here, or trying, and we're all living these wonderful and difficult lives.
Totally. That's a good way to look at it. Do you feel like your attention span is suffering to some degree as a result of screens?
Oh yeah. I was working on a book deadline a couple of years ago. I didn't have time for any kind of distraction or doing something fun outside of writing, and so I found myself editing on one laptop, and I had another laptop sitting next to me playing a movie. So I could, and I'd pick a movie that was that was a documentary or something that it would at least trigger some thoughts. But I was like, oh God, this is how you get your free time in, by writing and watching a movie at the same time, or by, waiting for something in the movie to trigger you. And yeah, it's distracting. It was kind of crazy. You get book deadlines can get like that, a little convoluted. And I feel like yeah, I think in shorter pieces now. I think in bites and bits, and again, I think it's a tool. I think it's something that you can use to go, okay, well, if you're only going to use one line to say this, then make it good. Work on this, learn from it.
Yeah. I want to shift a little bit to a question about performance. I've seen you read a few times, and you invite the audience into your experience by exuding excitement. Was this performance element always a part of your career, or did that sort of develop over time?
I think it probably started when I was guiding, river guide, in my late teens and my 20s, and I guess I still do it. And I learned, when the weather is terrible or you've had a bad day and a flip and people are soaked, and you got to tell a story. You got to, otherwise they're going to come off the trip going, that was awful. Our guide sucked. Yeah, that's the moment you go, okay, everybody, listen. I'm going to take you to a place where you're going to forget for a moment how cold your fingertips are. And I learned to tell stories around fires, and then I learned, a bit of theatrics, the magic trick of raising your voice, of moving around. It transports people. It takes people to the story. And so over the years, I've become more of a performer, working with musicians, or, getting up on stage with images and playing with choreography and cues, and basically doing a magic show for stories, because it's an effective way at conveying the sensation. Because I always feel like telling a story, writing one, it's not enough. I always want to go to the reader and go, oh, this is nothing. Like, what you're reading is such a scratch of the surface. If you had been there, if you had witnessed this, if you had smelled it, and all the things that I just can't fit on the page, it would blow your mind. And so when I have access to images and footage and musicians, dancers, whatever it is, then I can bring in a bit more of this is about sensations. This is not just about you reading words on a page. This is about smells and light and things that are real. And so you can use performance to remind the audience that they're in an actual tactile space.
So try to get them as close as possible to that original experience.
Yeah, and sometimes it's just by opening up sensations, by making them real. If you can talk all you want about water, but to hold it in your palm is a much different experience.
So you mentioned you were out in Southeast Utah looking at some rock art, and that's because you're working on a new book for Torrey House Press, right?
Yeah. Came out of it's happening. I've spent a lot of time looking at rock art, and this book just appeared finally, and so now I'm in the thick of gathering and writing.
What made you want to do it right now?
Rock art has been a tricky subject that I've danced around in writing, because I look at it and go, well, you can't really define anything from this. And it's not like an artifact that you can date and put into a certain cultural sequence. But then I've learned where those sequences are and how I can define this or describe it. I feel like after 20 years, 30 years of intensive rock art searches, I can finally write about it. And I was down at there's a panel in Southeast Utah called the Desecration Panel that was destroyed, I think in the 40s or 50s, when there was an illness, and a Navajo shaman singer instructed a family to go to a certain panel and destroy it, and it was ritually destroyed. And being there during the pandemic and thinking about what this panel meant to somebody, that they came in, not just graffiti destroyed it, but actually ritually chopped this thing to pieces on the rock face. And I just it struck me how powerful these sites still are, that they carry not just memory and story, but they carry a power that somebody had to go and destroy the panel to stop that power, or, in theory, stop it. And I just, I came away from looking at that panel and just going, what, there's a power here that sits in these places, that is more than memory, that is still living. And I'd like to convey that. And I'd like to convey my experiences around it, and other people, what they have to say. I want rock art to be more than just looking at a rock wall and going, oh, look, some people did some stuff here once upon a time. I want to say, no, this is a language. There are connections across thousands of years, and these are still active. There's a reason that it's in this place.
It sounds like related to what we already touched on about stories being embedded in the particular landscape.
Yeah, and this is a way of seeing somebody else's story, because it was, in one way or another, it was meant to be seen. Whereas so many archaeological artifacts seem private. They came out of burials, or somebody's room that they didn't show it to everybody. But these things on the rock wall, they were, if meant for a clan, if meant for strangers, if meant for whoever, it was meant to tell a story.
Do you have anything you've written so far that you'd be willing to share with us?
Sure. Right now I don't write on the computer that much until the rubber hits the road.
Yeah.
Mostly I'm writing by hand. And this is from my journal. Just from a couple days ago, where I was looking at a birthing panel, a woman giving birth in a petroglyph, and the number of places you could have a rock art cluster like this one, from my view, are endless. House-sized rocks with smoothed, patinaed surfaces in the thousands. Annunciatory cliff bands ready for art in the several hundreds. Extrapolate that to what can't be seen along miles of mesa edge, a great wall of China on a scale that you wouldn't take your eyes off of from space, and the possible rock art sites number in the millions. Step out to the edge and look over, seeing layer cake edges dropping one after the next, a mile of vertical space, red cliffs up top, gray pyramids and goosenecks below, chasms within chasms. The lifetimes it would take to stop at every face, reincarnated with a clipboard to make sure you don't miss any, are numberless. Why is this one here? Why has a woman on a rock given birth to a fair-haired child looking across an infinite expanse of mythic terrain? Looking down from here, a climb up seems impossible, but then you put it together. Several hundred feet down, tumbled boulders are decorated with petroglyphs. Between here and there, in a theater of cliffs, is a diagonal crack breaching out of a talus slope, a route that would get you through. The rock art is here because this is a way.
Awesome.
So that was from 2 days ago, out in the field.
So is this going to be just mostly along the Colorado Plateau, or what?
Sticking to originally I wanted to go all the way down into the Sonoran Desert and into the Mojave because there's so much other stuff, but Colorado Plateau is it's actually, even writing about the plateau, I feel like I'm barely touching it because there's so much here.
Sure. I just really love seeing, in particular, panels where they're overlapping cultures. Like, I'm thinking Buckhorn Wash in the Santa Fe Swell, that has the desert archaic, Barrier Canyon style stuff, and then also Fremont on top of it, and then also the Sago Canyon site having also desert archaic and Ute. Yeah,
and that's another layer where I find myself really focused on Basketmaker in this book. And I'd planned on a lot of Ute and Navajo, but now I'm going, oh my gosh, I'm so wrapped up in Basketmaker. I can't even get to the top layers of the rock art. I'm just in this middle layer. And you mentioned Barrier Canyon stuff. In some ways, as I'm writing this book, I'm thinking, maybe you ought to not mention too much about that and save it, because there's a whole book in Barrier Canyon rock art, or that's Buckhorn, the whole Santa Fe Swell, that ghosty old stuff with the big eyes. There's something going on there.
I can't help but want to interpret those because they're so otherworldly.
Yeah.
They just, like you said, there's something going on, and it seems to point to something going on that we can't explain. But I also at the same time feel like I have to refrain from making an interpretation because I just don't know. And do you feel that tension? You want to come up with something, but you also know you kind of can't.
Yeah, you naturally see the puzzle, and you want to put the pieces together, which I think that's admirable. I think that's valuable. But I think it should be balanced with also realizing that these pieces will not come together. For this book, I'm talking to people from Zuni, Hopi, and getting different stories, putting them together to say, okay, well, this rock art, we will never know what it is. Nobody will ever know what it is, but we will know bits and pieces of it. And when you put them all together, you might see how over time the meaning of this rock art has changed. And you might get close to what it was originally meant to be, but you'll never know. And I love that about it, is that you have to have these two ways of knowing in your head at the same time. The way of knowing that says, okay, here's a problem, let's solve it. what is this? How do you interpret it? And then the other way of knowing is to say, you can't. Whatever you're thinking is imagination, which is a powerful thing. I mean, you read it there in the Wendell Berry quote that you need to imagine your landscape. You need to pass beyond just what you know and go into the other possibilities. So I think both of these can and should happen at the same time. But yeah, there's tension because, I look at something and I think, well, what are they doing there on that rock panel? What is that corn? Is that a warfare scene? It just comes up, and I think that's fine. But know that that's not what it is.
Yeah, it feels like a practice of being okay with not knowing on some level.
Yeah, I think you'll see it, but you'll never know what it is.
Yeah. And why Basketmaker? Why is that drawing you in more than the other stuff right now?
I think that was probably the most elaborate period of rock art making in the Southwest on a big scale. I think the Barrier Canyon work is some of the most dynamic, but it's a smaller group. It's regionally restricted. Basketmaker. One person I was talking to who studies this rock art calls them the Basketmaker Empire, because the same motifs show up in such different places. And they're so elaborate. You can see the processions and the stories, the adornment. They really went into detail. Where when people started making great houses and large architectural features, I sometimes wonder if that's where creative energy went, and not so much into the rock art. Because there is some incredible Pueblo rock art, but really it seemed like they were putting their work into architecture and trade routes and big civilization kind of stuff, whereas basket makers were before that. They weren't so much on the grand public scale, except for in their rock art, and I find it just fascinating what they were doing. You can start to read a story because there's so much of it, whereas the Barrier Canyon stuff, I look at that and go, whoa, I don't know what I'm looking at here, but I know it's powerful. I know that, a giant ghost figure with a snake in its mouth and a little person with wings on his shoulder. That's there's something happening. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. The Barrier Canyon style is the stuff that I love. The Basketmaker stuff too, but it is the Barrier Canyon style stuff that I start to, when I spend a lot of time out there, I've started to make these connections that are just probably my own fabrications completely, but I'm going, okay, it looks like, this tall figure. I look at it and then I look over at the desert varnish and I'm like, that looks like the same thing, kind of. And then I look over at Virga and I'm like, oh, that looks like the same thing, kind of, too. And you start to see these like repeating patterns in the landscape that aren't just the rock art, they're the actual landscape, too. You know what I mean?
Yeah. How many times have you been tricked by thinking that desert varnish is in the distance? You go, oh, that's a Barrier Canyon figure, or in the distance you go, oh, that's just desert varnish, and then you walk up closer and go, oh no, it's not. Yeah, I think that I feel like the figures, the long tapering legless figures came out of desert varnish and Virga. I think, yeah, that's we were talking about how stories repeat themselves on the landscape. That I would say is one of the repeating stories. Is at its core, it's iron oxide and minerals washed down and oxidized on a cliff face, and they leave that pattern. But then that pattern is a story that you start telling in a different way, but it's still the pattern.
It's so exciting for me to hear you say that, because I've been thinking about this for a long time, and to hear you sort of mirror that is cool.
It's hard not to see that.
It is hard not to see that.
It seems so obvious that people were repeating what they saw that was beautiful on the cliffs.
It makes it also feel like both the Virga and the Desert Varnish reference water, and so it's not hard to make a jump to just simply a prayer for rain,
Yeah.
creating something that mimics these things that are associated with water.
Yeah, and everything being about rain here makes sense. I actually, now that you're saying it, I hadn't really thought about the Desert Varnish as a rain symbol, but of course it is. It's,
of course,
when you're looking for a shelter out of the rain, you look for where there's no desert varnish. And you go, okay, well, that's a dry spot. I can get under there. Yeah, that's a great connection.
Yeah. So we touched on trying to be a good citizen of this place, the only place you're familiar with, this place of aridness, and I relate to that. I've been in Utah my entire life, but I actually also feel this tension in being, I'm like 50% Scottish. I have heritage in Georgia. I'm a first generation Utahn, but also I've lived here my whole life. It's all I know. I have no actual lineage in this particular landscape, and yet it's the only thing I know. I'm not like, I have heritage in the Scottish Highlands, for example, but does that mean that I should go there? I wonder if you feel a tension as well of, I'm not from here very deeply. I've never had to subsist off of this place, and yet it's all I know.
Yeah. I think that's that encapsulates a lot of what I think.
Yeah,
because I feel like my generations here are so few, while other generations, Ute, Paiute, Navajo, Pueblo, go back so far that I feel like I just landed here. I just showed up. I can in the Southwest, I can trace my family back to my father and my grandfather in southern New Mexico, my mother and her grandmother born in West Texas in the Big Bend area, and then that's it. Then it's Missouri and Pennsylvania, and then it's Wales and Germany, and what would we do if someday down the road people said, okay, go back. You took this place. Now give it back to us and go back where you came from. And I imagine going to Wales and going, hi, you have a place for me? Because this is the place I know. And yeah, you haven't had to subsist here, but subsistence is a term that can have different definitions. You do subsist here. You live off of this place. I mean, just this podcast is in a place, is connecting with this place, is feeding, is being fed from this place. So I think that we have different ways of subsisting now. But yeah, you'd be a lot more connected if you were eating the elk and gathering rice grass seeds, and that was your way of living. But I feel this conundrum all the time that hey, I just got here and I'm trying to figure out where I am and what's going on around me. And I'm hesitant to go to Zuni and Hopi and talk to people for what I'm trying to put together for rock art, because I think, well, what's my purpose here? I'm just trying to root myself deeper into somebody else's landscape, and maybe getting to the point where I can say, well, I belong to this landscape as well. I know no other place, not like I do here. I believe there is even if you don't have family lines that go back generations, you are still here. And so when I look at Zuni, Hopi, Acoma, Tewa, I think, well, yeah, my children may be moving on. Who knows if they're going to stay here or not, or they may end up in New York or in China, or you know, this may be, I may be the end of this line seeking a place on the Colorado Plateau or in the southwest. But still, that's my line. That's where I am. I work with the givens, and the given in front of me is the land that I'm on, is this country, that this is the solid thing, the Muggy Rim, the Colorado Plateau, the Sonoran Desert. I think we belong to these places.
That gets back to what you said earlier about responsibility. If we belong to these places, maybe we have a responsibility to give back.
Yeah, and part of that responsibility, I think, the part of the giving back is understanding enough to know what to give back. And I still, there, at Hopi, I drop in there and talk to people, for decades now about project I'm working on, things I've found that might offer something in return, but I'm always wondering, what's the reciprocity here? How do I give back? And I feel like my understanding is coming so slowly that I'll be dead and gone before I ever really figure out what needs to be fed back to this place and the people of this place. But at least I can get close. At least I can do my best.
That's all we can do. Just try.
Yeah, try like hell.
You're a science writer, and I don't know if when you started out writing, you viewed science as sort of apolitical, but it seems like clearly now, with things like climate change, science has become politicized. And not that it should be, but that's just happened. And I wonder how that feels, if you've always recognized yourself as having to engage with politics because of being a science writer, or if that's something that's more new.
Yeah, it's definitely something I'm engaging more with. I think the last 4 or 5 years have required an engagement that maybe I was hesitant to get involved with before. Yeah, politics is more central for me now. It's hard to get away from it, and I might have 10 years ago, 20 years ago, I might have said that something can be apolitical, but in this environment right now, it would be a stretch for anything not to be political, which I'm not particularly fond of, because I've tried to write in a way that I'm leaving the audience to make the decision, because I get tired of reading stuff where people are saying, this is what you need to think, this is how you need to act, and this is what you need to respond with. And I feel like that's part of the problem. I know writers who are really good at that. Mary Sojourner is one who can just tackle things and just gets her teeth in there. And I've always been kind of on the other side of that, saying, okay, I want to speak to everybody here. I want somebody who doesn't necessarily hold my political beliefs to get well into a book before they recognize that I have certain beliefs, and then to go, okay, whatever, and keep reading. Because what this is about is me saying, you love this land? Hey, I love it too. You like a good desert sunrise? So do I. We have things in common here. The ground, we love the ground. We love to walk on it. Here's what I've learned. Here's something that I can hand across that might make you think that this is worth saving, or not consuming all of it. So I try to keep my politics under the radar, because it can get in the way of what I'm trying to convey. It can make it too superficial. That's why like a call to action. Sometimes I go, hey, I might not be the call to action person in the way that I'm saying, get up and do this one thing, because I'm not telling you to go fight my war for me. I'm telling you that there is a war going on. And here are the facts. Here's the information I've got. I think science, as much as possible, should be apolitical. It should be a gathering of facts and then laying them out. Climate has really challenged that, because you gather the facts and then you go, okay, nobody's listening. These facts seem irrelevant, and so we have scientists who are moving out in front saying, hey, we actually need to listen to this. This is a warning call. We need to respond, and here's the information. Which I think that has that's a necessary component. Science needs to have that. It needs to have that fire in the lead. But at its core, I think science needs its objectivity. It needs to be faithful to truth and not so much to idea.
So you can't exactly be neutral, you're saying, anymore.
No. I don't think anybody was ever neutral.
Yeah.
I think but there is some, in places, neutrality has to still exist. We have to be able to have a language to communicate with. So I think, like different ways of knowledge, you can have neutrality and activism at the same time. You just choose how to translate that, how to where you fit in. And I guess I've seen enough change that I'm starting to point it out. Whereas I think my earlier writing, I was going, hey, look at this thing. And now I'm going, oh, hey, look at this thing now compared to what it was. I can actually see it. I can see the scale of change. And now that I have real participatory reflection on it, I can talk about the politics of it in a way that I don't think I could before, because I don't think I understood it well enough. But now, I go back down to the border. I go to these places where I spent time and see how much they've changed. And, I can see it in my writing. Now I'm writing about what it's like to cross the border, what it's like to be in a van full of people trying to get into the U.S., what the militarization of the border feels like, people who are suffocating in the back of trucks, hiding as they're coming across. Yeah, this stuff I'm much closer to than I was when I first started writing.
Yeah, it feels inevitable. It's just such a strange time.
Yeah, well, everything's. I feel like the playing field is full of more players now than before, which I think it's an amazingly creative time. I think a lot can happen right now. It's in periods of instability and uncertainty that the future is most malleable. And we're here now at a moment where the future is, I think, more uncertain than I've ever seen. And when I talk to elders, they've seen a lot too, and they agree. And so to me, that means this is the time to make. This is the time to create, because it's open. And voices are out. Voices, we're hearing more voices now than I think we've heard in a long time. Some voices we don't want to hear, but they're there. And some voices are we really wanted to hear, and they're coming out. I think of Deb Holland, who's going to be running the Department of the Interior. Yeah, that these voices are rising up. And I think about that in my writing, is how can I help voices come up? How can I use the space that I'm in and not necessarily politicize, but bounce off of the politics, take it somewhere. We'll be figuring this stuff out as storytellers for the rest of our lives. That's how this works.
Yeah, and maybe never figure it out, like you said.
But we'll move it forward. We'll give it energy. We'll feed the future.
I think it would be great if you had something else that you wanted to read that you've been working on. That'd be a really great place to end. If you don't, that's okay.
Something in here, but it would probably be there's so much scribbling. Let me see. Indian Creek, Lavender Canyon, Rock Creek. Let me just try a couple. Actually, this is something I opened up the other day and I hadn't titled it, so I was trying to figure out where it was. And it only happened a couple weeks ago. That's what's happening right now as I'm out in so many places. I'm like, which day, which place? Warm sun panel over the confluence of creek and river penned by red cliffs and boulder slopes, chains of handholders, petroglyphs, articulated footprints larger than human, and the usual array of cosmic immortals and bighorn sheep. It is not a dramatic panel, busy and a little roughly done, but perfectly clear to the eye. This was a gathering place.
I love that. Well, thank you so much for joining us. This was great.
Thanks for having me. And thanks for moving stories along.
That was Craig Childs. Thanks so much, Craig. He was interviewed by our own Ben Kilborn, who also did the sound. Thanks so much, Ben. Insight is supported by the town of Springdale, the Division of Utah Arts and Museums, the O.C. Tanner and Eccles Foundations. We thank you all for your faith and funding. I'm Logan Hebner for the Zion Canyon Mesa Arts and Humanities Residency. This has been Insight. Thank you for your time. Stay tuned and stay safe.